Now I'm looking at the clouds, the sky replacement, and it feels a little dark. I mean, I like them, but I'd like to lighten them a little bit, or maybe do a color correction to it. Let me go back to my Media tab. I'll select the Image 1 front for this. You can see there's the clouds. We're not using the matte on it, but there's where it reads CC. So this top one, which will affect the front, I'll double click on it, and just like the master keyer, we step into the color correction tool. But it's only going to be applied to this individual layer source, the front. I'm just going to come over to my gamma for RGB, and I'm just going to brighten this up a little bit like that. Now when you're in the color correction tool like this, inside of Action, you can change what you're looking at by going to the lower left corner. It says Result right now, still the hotkey is F4, but if I go to Color Correction Views, I can choose Context, which now is going to show me the end result out in action. And I can really adjust the color correction and see how it's going to end up looking. And I kind of like that better. So I'm just really brightening it up. I thought it was a little dark for the scene that we were working on. That looks a little better. So once I'm done with that, I can choose Return. And I'm also not totally happy where my text is sitting. So Auto Key is on. So be careful. Be always aware of Auto Key, depending upon what frame you're at. I'm going to go to the last frame here with my text. With my text selected, the geometry. In fact, I'll double click on it. Actually, I want my axis selected, so I'll select the axis. I'll take the Y position, just bring this up just a little bit. Then if I select my geometry again, I can see the keyframes for the transparency settings. I'll use the Go to Previous Keyframe button to make sure that's exactly what I want. This looks good. So now he's going to turn and walk into it. I really want just the top of his head to walk into this. But be careful making adjustments to anything when you're not at the first or last frame, because Auto Key is on. Now, if you want to experiment or you want to adjust things without creating keyframes, just turn that off. Now we can come in here and make adjustments to this so it does fit exactly where we want it to be, and we're comfortable with the fact that we're not creating a keyframe. So this is starting to look really good. The last thing we want to do as far as our scene in 3D is create shadows falling on the alleyway to really sell this shot. So let's do this. We're going to add another light into the scene, and we're going to use this light as the sun. There's a tool called the Shadow Cast, and this tool has to be applied to a light. So let's take another light. I'll drag it into my schematic, double click on it. Let's Shift L right away, get our light link tool, drag off of it, drop it on our geometry. We don't want it to affect anything but the 3D text. Shift M, go back to my select move tool. And for the Y position, we're going to set this very high. So I'll set this to 10,000 because I want it way above the scene. So that's good. Now with this light selected, in fact, again, organizing, we can name things. I'll name this Sun. Okay, light sun. Now I'll go back to my action bin. With this light selected, I take the Shadow Cast tool, I drag it into my schematic. It'll automatically connect it for me. Now the issue here though is we have nothing really in 3D space for this shadow to fall on. If I switch this view, Shift 4 to the top view, there is nothing there to catch the shadows. I'll hit this view once again, hit escape, go back to my schematic. So let's bring in a color source, a color frame that we can then position and model to fit the curvature of the alley and have the shadow fall on that. To do that, I need to go to Connect Effects. So I can do it for my flyout, or I'm just going to hold Control, hit Escape. I now stepped out of my action node. I'm back at the top level of my Connect Effects. Go to the Connect Effects tools, enable that little button right there. I'll hit the C key, brings up all my tools that start with C, and there's one called Color Frame. I'll drag and add it into the scene. Double click on it to get its parameters. All this is a source that is a color frame, matching the duration, the resolution, and everything. You can switch it to be noise, empty bars, gradients, and so on, but I'll leave it to a color frame, and we want to bring this into action now. So with the action node selected, hold Control and hit the N key. It gives me another input. I'll hold the Alt key and just kiss and connect it. In all honesty, I don't even really need the matte input, so I'm just going to drag across and cut that. Not a big deal. It didn't matter. We could have turned off the matte. In fact, let's turn off the matte just to make sure there's no transparency happening with this color frame inside of action. Now select the action tool. I'll hit the escape key, go into its schematic, and there is our color source. First thing we want to do, we want to take the tracking data. We want to apply it to this. So again, I drag off of it, just the edge of it, and drop it onto that, to this axis for my solid frame. What happens? It shifts it up to align it to where the original tracker box was. Double click on the axis for this new color source to access its parameters. We want to take the X rotation value and set it to -90. And then I'll use the X and the Y position values to set it and position it where it would be somewhere down by his feet. Now we need to add this new color frame as something or an element that this light sun is going to affect. Shift L, get my light link tool, drag off of the light, and drop it on the image. And then I'll press Shift M to go back to my select tool. Now if I hold Shift and hit 4 for this view here, we can see the shadows are taking place. They're happening down there, but what we want to do is manipulate the light in Z space so that it moves forward a little bit before the intersection point of our color frame and our other footage. So let me hit the escape key to go back to my schematic. I'll make sure I double click on my light, my sun. I'll take the Z parameter and start to manipulate it. I'll take it to about -600. Now you can see the shadow of this light is falling on that plane. And then with the shadow cast tool selected, you've got your softness controls you can adjust. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave everything pretty much set to the default here, because the concept of what I'm going to do is composite the shadow output of this out in Connect Effects. But if you wanted to control your shadows, you've got tons of controls, from decay controls, transparency, color, the shadow softness, the focus, and color bleed, and so on. Because what we're going to do is create multiple outputs coming out of action. One will be our shadow, and one will be the rest of the comp, everything but this color source. But before we get there, I want to take this one step further, because in all honesty, our alley is not flat like this color source that I just created. In fact, let me show you a hotkey. You want to hide something, select it, hit the H key, and it's hidden. It even reads hidden. Now you can see we don't see the color source. Hit H again with it selected, and it comes back. My point is, if we hide that one more time, you look at the alley, there's actually a curvature that's happening. I want to bend this footage. Let me hit H to bring it back. I want to bend this footage so it matches that curvature, so the shadows really look like they're falling on the ground. So with this image selected, go over to the surface controls. Remember what I said? Over on the left is your axis controls for what's selected. Over on the right is going to be the individual controls. And in this case, it's an image, so we have our surface controls. Switch this to be extended by cubics. Now you'll see I've got control points that if I wanted to, I can come in and start bending and manipulating this in 3D space. I'm going to undo that. I just wanted to show you that. What we want to do is go further with this. We want to subdivide this into vertices. So down here on the image, with it set to extended by cubics, you'll notice the vertice option is available. Choose vertices, and now we access all the vertice controls. Click subdivide once. So I just created one subdivision of this image. Click on one of the vertices on the center to activate them. Then I'll hold the Command key and I'll region select all of them. So all of these vertices are now selected. Now I'm going to switch this view, my default camera view that I'm using, to be another 3D view, but I want it to be the front view. So if I start to manipulate the Z position for that to a negative value, I am bending that image. In fact, if we go back, we can look at the end result once again, F4, and as I make that and bend that down, you can see how we're able to actually bend that source, that color frame, to mimic and match the curvature of the alley. All right, that's getting me to where I want to be. Let me go back over here to my schematic. Now we need to create multiple outputs. I just mentioned this. What we want to do is output the end result of our composite, but not with this big white color source laying there. And then we want to output just the end result of our shadows. This is what's great about action, is that we can output more than just one thing. Going over here on the left, go to the Output tab. By default, we have one output. and also by default is going to include everything that is in our scene. We don't want that. In this output, I do not want this white color frame. So go to your tools, go to the top, choose Edit Output. Now go right into the schematic view and click on your color frame. You'll notice in the output, you don't see it anymore because now we've just told Smoke, do not include that in your main output. But choose the copy option with this output selected. We now have two outputs. I still have my Edit Output tool selected. Click again with this new one selected on image 4. It adds it back in. Now the color frame doesn't reappear in the view for this output because we're still looking at the original output that we just told it not to include it. But if you look at my possible views, I now have two different outputs that I can switch between. But I'll leave my view at the main output. But we need to change one more thing, so make sure I go back to my Output tab. With this new one selected, you'll see it reads Type. Tell it we want you to output just the shadow. You can also do ambient occlusion, Z-depth, and different matte options. But if I choose shadow, and you know what, just for organization, we can select this, I can choose rename, and I can name this output shadow. Something like that, okay? So now I've got two outputs coming out of this action tool. I'm going to switch to my select tool, and I'll hold Control and hit Escape. We step back out to Connect Effects, and look at the outputs now. We have one main output, and then there's a secondary output now coming out of action. The bottom one is our shadow. So the point of this is, in Connect Effects, I have different compositing tools, and I want to composite them together. So if I hit the L key, I bring up the Logic Op tool. I drag that in. I'm going to hold Alt and hit the Shift key. And then I'm going to connect the front to be the bottom connection coming out of action, which is the shadow. I'll hit Shift again to get my background. And I'm going to connect that to the main output of the action node. Lastly, I'm just going to quickly connect the output of the Logic Op to my CFX, which is going back to the timeline. Now if I double click on the Logic Op tool, it brings up its parameters. I'll switch the blend mode to be a multiply. Now you're starting to see where we're going with this. I have a transparency setting that I can start dialing down to control the transparency of the shadows that are falling in the alley. Let's take this further. I'm going to go to my effects node. I want to blur my shadows. Now I could have did that in action, but I'm just going to do it here. This is what I like about the flexibility of working in a schematic like this and all the tools that I have available inside of Smoke. So I'll come down to my tools. I hit B for blur. I'll take my blur tool and I want it to affect the shadow. I wait till I see the red connection is highlighted and I drop it on it. So now my blur is affecting the shadow pass. So I want to look at the end result of Connect Effects in this view, no matter what tool I have selected. Or you can hit the 0 key if you wanted to. But with the blur tool selected, I can now go and blur my shadows a little bit, select the Logic Op, maybe bring the transparency back a little more. So now we've created the end result of what I was trying to accomplish. There's still one problem. The light rig that we see up here, I didn't even mention it before, but this is the true story. This light rig was in the alley for a previous shot they did. And then they went and they did this shot, not realizing the light rig was still up. Well, they just didn't see it. So they either were going to break the light rig down and reshoot everything, or, as you would expect, they knew they could fix it in post. So they knew they could fix that inside of Smoke. So they left it as it was. So what we're going to do now is introduce the paint tool inside of Smoke to do a recursive clone on this. So I go to my effects node, I hit P, I get my paint tool, I'll drag it into my schematic. Let me zoom over here. I'll hold Option Shift, connect that right there to the output of my backplate. The original footage goes into my paint tool. I'll double click on the paint tool if I don't see the parameters. I'm going to focus on the paint tools just as they were used for rotoing this out, okay? Let's zoom in on this view to see what we're doing. Now this is a pretty easy one, thank goodness, because of the fact that there wasn't too much movement and there wasn't a lot of stuff going on. There's many different ways of eliminating this rig. You could have created a mask and duplicated the image and shifted the footage over. There's lots of different ways. I'm just going to do a down and dirty method of painting this out. So in the paint tools, the first thing I need to do is tell Smoke what frames I want to paint on. By default, it's current frame. So if you have to paint frame by frame by frame, which happens at times, unfortunately, that's what you would leave it set to. Or you can set from frame. That would mean if I'm at the 30th frame and I paint, it's going to affect here to the end. But if I set this back to the first frame and I choose the sequence, it's going to paint on every single frame. Next is my paint mode. I want to tell it to be a recursive clone because we want the frames updating every single frame with the frames that we're painting on. Okay, now in the view, well, you know what? We have to have our view set to the end result of the paint tool. Right now, you see what I've got it set to? I'm looking at my Connect Effects result. So I'm not going to be able to access my paintbrush in the view. But if I hit F4, there's my paintbrush. So now we're looking at the end result of this node, not the end result of Connect Effects. So anyways, let's just recap real quick. I've got my paint set to my paint on, set to sequence. I've got my paint mode, recursive clone. I go into the viewport. If you want to change the brush size, you can do it down in the parameters, or you can hold the Q key and click and drag and make the brush larger. I've got the default brush selected with a nice feather to it. We want to hold Shift, Control, and click down. That sets where you're taking the pixels from. Then move over and click again. That sets the distance of where the brush is going to be from the pixels you're going to recursively clone. Now I'll come over here to start clicking down and I paint this out. Just come through really quickly. You can create as many paint strokes as you want. Like I said, because it's brick, it actually works out pretty well. And if you need to reposition things, hold Shift Control again. I'll click here, then I'll click down. Then I can hold the Q key again and bring my size down a little bit. And maybe come along here and just be really careful. Like I said, there's many different ways of doing this. I'm just doing a down and dirty method here because it's brick and it's pretty easy to hide and paint that out. So what's next? We need to add that paint tool as our source, our media source. So right now, if you look at action once again, we see the light rig. Let me drag the main output of my paint and drop it on the front input for this layer. And then I'll do the same for this. I'll select this, drag out, and drop it on that layer. Now I select the action node. You can see we've removed and I painted out those frames. Now, in all honesty, I really only needed to connect the paint to the first media input that I connected it to. The second one, because of the mask, it really will never even be seen, but whatever. Now, before I exit back to my timeline, I want to set some preferences to improve the rendering quality of this. So with the action node selected, we can go to our preferences, our node preferences, and I might want to go to my rendering tab and turn on anti-aliasing. Maybe we'll add 2 samples or maybe 3. Do I want to add motion blur? I don't really think I need it in this case. And then I would select my CFX preferences and let's turn on our hardware. Let's go to 4 times hardware anti-aliasing. You can go up to 8 depending upon what you're trying to achieve. Obviously, this is going to add time to the rendering, but it's also going to add the quality to the rendering, especially with the 3D text that we've added. We want that to look as good or as best as it possibly can. But once you're done, I've gotten to this point, I am ready to render this out. Selecting my CFX node, you can see the shadow. I love the fact that we were able to bend that source to really make it feel like it's following the movement of the alley. We've got a nice shadow. I'm liking everything. We choose Exit CFX. We're back at our timeline. We've got a clip here. I can select it. Then I can start my render by hitting my backward slash key. Now this is going to take about 2 minutes to render this. So I'm going to do some editing. And we'll come back right after it finishes rendering to look at the end result. So now the render is finished. It took less than 2 minutes actually. Let me go back to the beginning frame and let's play that back. Alright, so that's how a shot like this could be created using Smoke, using Connect Effects, all of its tools and action. And in all honesty, at this point, there was a color grade added on top of this, and then there was also a vignette added to it throughout the entire timeline. But this is the beauty, is that all this was done in Smoke. All this was done in the editor. And you get to see the end result of what you've created in context of your timeline. And if you have to make a change, It's a one-button click. You step right back into Connect Effects, make the change, go back out to your timeline. That's the beauty of having Connect Effects inside your timeline, inside of Smoke. Okay, well that wraps up this tutorial. It went a little longer than I thought it would, but I think it covered a lot, and hopefully you did learn from it. And I plan on making more tutorials such as this to be posted here on my blog and other areas. So, thanks a lot for your time.